I mean, maybe not.
I just asked Brenden if he was ready to do this. You don't have a choice anymore. Welcome. Happy afternoon.
Thank you.
It's great to have you. The audience should know that you came down from your cottage home basically up north for this. So we super appreciate that you've gone out of your way just for really good, consistent internet access. I want to sort of start this conversation off just by letting the audience know sort of what we're going to talk about today. There's a lot of conversations. I mean, you and I had this conversation when we first had a phone call about one of the challenges when interviewing DPs is that, especially if they're at a really high level, the rhetoric is always the same. And it's always around like working with 18K lights and big budgets and huge art departments and things like that. And while it's very fascinating, to listen to, and I'm sure, you're going to talk a little bit about your work on Titans and Alias Grace, I'm sure, and things like that, and some of the bigger productions that you've been involved in. When we leave those conversations, albeit feeling very inspired, we leave with this sense that, well, how does that really apply to me, the indie filmmaker? How am I going to learn anything from that when I'll never really have an 18K for my productions? I'll never really have, an art department with a budget of, $50,000 or $100,000. So what you and I decided would be a great thing to talk about is that even on these really big levels, that cinematographers are sometimes using very simple techniques and very simple equipment that we all have access to. And that the concept of cinematography is really surrounding yourself with the story and letting the story dictate how you're going to light that. And it doesn't always mean you need a lot of money. And that's our job as a cinematographer, is to be able to take what resources we have and elevate the story. Excuse me. And so I'm really excited. You've got a ton of examples that you're going to be sharing, stills and things like that, and talking about your approach and how that approach can be utilized in just about every situation for the indie filmmakers. So thank you very much. I'm very excited to get into this. Why don't you, Brenden, give us a sense, the audience, about who you are in terms of how you got started in this business and how you kind of got to where you are today.
I keep trying to figure out how I got to where. I guess I started like as I started as a PA. I started as a volunteer PA, like working for free on a commercial, and it was like through a neighbor. I mean, I guess I'd made like a few like films with friends, and we'd done some stuff for no money and played around with like a Bolex and whatever. And then I wanted to start working in the industry. I had become obsessed by that point, and I was like determined to work in film. And my mom's neighbor was a commercial director who gave me a chance to get on set as a PA. And I was completely in love, and I knew I wanted to do that. I was like blown away by what a professional set looked like. And they asked me to come back on the second day and actually get paid. And I was like, I can't believe you can make money doing this. So I came and I worked as a PA, and I did that for the summer. I was still in university, so I did that for the rest of the summer. And then I guess I came back after I finished school to Toronto. I went to school in Montreal, and I came back to Toronto because there was sort of I knew some people in film here, so it was a good place to start. And I wound up falling into music videos, which was like at the time such an amazing place to be learning and working. And there's a company called Blackwalk at the time. It was like sort of Blackwalk and Revolver were the two big music video companies at the time, and I sort of got in with Blackwalk like as soon as I came back and started working as a PA again, volunteering and trying in, because they were a lot of time like sort of low budget jobs. You got a chance to try a lot of different things and maybe like try things beyond your experience level would necessarily like beyond where you'd expect to find yourself, which was great because you just, the learning curve was so quick. You learn so much stuff so fast doing that, and a lot of things about each department. It's kind of like a thing that doesn't really exist anymore. It's too bad. It was the best film school available at the time, because we were shooting with professional equipment and shooting, you were shooting on 35 and you had like a lighting package and you had like whatever, but but they were still low budget, and that was only a bit like possible because the company owned stuff and they could like rent it themselves at a huge discount, and you could kind of just get every job sort of had like a similar base package, so you were getting in. The chance to work on a sort of high level professional set that didn't actually have a lot of money, so you were given the opportunity to do like a lot more than you would otherwise have been able to do. And I just learned a ton really quickly there and got to try a bunch of different departments, went through camera and then grip, and then ultimately found myself in lighting for a while. I worked as a gaffer for a couple of years.
Wow. Do you remember any part of that process where you felt the learning curve was the most advanced? Was it as your work within the electrical department, or where did you feel like those skills that you have today, at what point did they really start accelerating for you?
It's a good question. I mean, by the time I was working in lighting, I'd already been working for like a little while. So I'd sort of, I think it was good to have had the perspective of all the different departments, but like each time I switched departments, which was like for a variety of different reasons, I already sort of had like a good base. And I'd started in camera. Like I tried really hard to get into camera because I thought that at that point I decided I wanted to start shooting, and camera seemed like an obvious path, but it actually turned out like in that time period where we were shooting film, like a second AC, like was spending a lot of your time in the bag loading mags, and there wasn't like I wasn't learning a lot about like shooting and lighting and stuff like that. It was a lot of like technical camera things, which was great to have the base in from that experience. But I wanted to learn like how to shoot and how to actually do that on set work. So I started working more as a technician and fell into lighting, and that seemed like a really good path.
One of the reasons that I ask that is a conversation that comes up on set once in a while with people in this particular role, whether they're a PA or a camera PA or something, and they're interested in the cinematography aspect, that there's this rhetoric that happens on set with all these other technicians giving them advice, like, oh, you should do this or you should do that.
Yeah.
And there's this big sort of debate about whether it's better to grow through the camera department or grow through the grip and electric department, right? What's more advantageous to the cinematographer is understanding lighting or understanding camera movement and camera placement and framing and things like that. Do you have any thoughts on this debate?
I mean, I feel like lighting is the most important. Like, I mean, obviously I feel that way because that was like, when I was there in that moment, and I had to make that decision, that seemed like the right decision to have made, and it worked out well for me. So I think there's a lot to be said for that path, especially, at a certain level, you wind up like not even being allowed to touch a camera anyway. Like I love operating, and I beg every time I get a job to like let me be the operator. But it's there are obstacles to that, and I do operate anytime I can. If I do like a lower budget film, like a single camera shoot, I do tend to operate. But on a multi-camera, like if you're doing a TV show where you're using two cameras all the time, if you're operating one, if they even let you, then you're not allowed. Then you're not able to see what the other camera's doing. And a lot of times you're just too busy, and there's too much lighting and too much other work. You need to stay ahead of things, and a lot of time you're occupied with that sort of stuff, and you're not even really touching cameras anymore. So I think like it's good to stay on top of the technical side of cameras, and it's important to understand like what makes a thing look a certain way from a camera perspective. But I think the most sort of influential element of cinematography in terms of like the look of something, not in terms of, I mean, camera movement's a whole other conversation, and we can get into that, but like if you take a still from any film, the thing that you see, there are really like, obviously there are like lots of elements. There's composition and framing, color, and all that, but like lighting is the sort of simplest way to influence the feeling of an image, right. I think.
Right. I'm trying to not impart too much of my own experience and opinion into this conversation, but because I never came up to the camera department. All my work was through grip and electric. That every time especially when I started shooting, what I found was like, oh my God, there's so many framing and camera movement choices that I just don't have in my vocabulary, that I don't even think of, right. Because I didn't have that experience. Is there any advice that you have for people in terms of who might still be coming up through the technician side, or they're not operating? One of the ways that they can build that framing lexicon, that they can that they can advance in that way?
Yeah, I feel like that comes not from working in the camera department, but from watching movies, from like just like watching as many films as like watching everything great, deciding what you like, and then like if you know a movie really well and you've never thought about it from a cinematography perspective, you just know the movie and you love it. It's really interesting to go back and watch it and like look at how they cover scenes and watch like when they move the camera and when they don't, and like how many shots they use for coverage, and whether that's a really cool exercise if if you want to figure out what makes something feel the way it does.
Yeah.
And sometimes it happens subconsciously. Like I remember that um, a great example actually, Michael Clayton, which is like I think a totally underrated, fantastic movie. But I saw it on Blu-ray like the years ago, but it was after it had come out in the theater. I missed it, and I saw it on Blu-ray. And there is a scene in the film where there's like a hit. They go and they kill one of the main characters. I don't want to give too much away, but I remember watching it and feeling like really tense, and I wasn't breathing. I was watching this thing and I was completely like, and then like sort of three-quarters through the sequence, I realized that they hadn't cut the camera, and I was like holding my breath waiting for a cut, and it was like a sort of subconsciously impactful thing that happens. And I had to go back and rewatch it because I wasn't sure how long it had been since there'd been a cut in the scene. But then going back and watching a film like that again, you realize like how carefully constructed it is, and how how they've manipulated your sort of emotional response to things by a lot of elements, but also by using framing and movement and the edit as well.
Right. And when you're working with different directors, even in your early years of shooting, when you're on smaller productions, can you sort of articulate how many of the times you were relied upon to present framing and camera movement ideas, and what percentage of time a director actually presents that?
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting thing. Different directors have different styles, and I always love like sort of going into a project and you sort of, if you're working with someone you don't know or haven't worked with before, there's an element of like feeling each other out and sort of seeing what your role is going to be. Because some people really, I've worked with directors who really just want to focus on actors and are pretty deferential and sort of let you have a lot of freedom to move the camera or to like light in a certain way or frame a certain way. There's a director I really like who I've worked with a few times who will say like, I need to be like here in this moment, and I need to be like there at this moment. And like what you do in the middle, I don't care. I need to get like this moment here and this moment there, and I'm going to work with the actors, and you figure out where the camera's going to be. And it's like, when you know that that's the dynamic, if they like sort of are clear that that's the way we're going to work together, it's really fun to prepare for that and to like, but it's equally fascinating to work with people who are like really specific and know exactly what they want, especially if you know their work. Like I did a movie with Roger Avery like a couple of years ago now, and I'd seen a bunch of his films before, and I thought like he had a really cool way of framing some things. And when we were talking about how to shoot a scene, I was like, okay, so I think he's like, well, if it was a Roger Avery movie, we would do this. I was like, oh right, of course, that's what we're. And it was like my impression of like what I thought we would do was way off, because I'd forgotten for a second, like, and as soon as he said it, I was like, oh, of course that's the way you want to do this, and it's like that's what makes your style like distinct.
Right.
That's super fun as well. Yeah. And it's always like, even in both of those models though, it still winds up being a collaborative process. It's just that the where exactly you have what exactly you contribute changes a little bit.
Right. And further to your saying about watching different films, I mean, obviously right now with the whole lockdown, this is a fantastic time for us to just like binge on Netflix and films and Amazon and all this sort of stuff. One of the things that, and this is, again, don't want to make this about me, but one of the things that I noticed a while back, I was watching some movie or some show on Netflix, and I remember seeing this like big booming shot, opening up a scene. And then I was like, yeah, there's always a jib shot opening up certain scenes. and but the style of the way they move the camera crane, it's not just booming up and down. There's a whole other movement to it, and blocking to it. So I took my phone and I started kind of making a note about, every time I saw a shot, I would, label it, and then I would write exactly what was happening on screen. So if something really caught my eye, I'd be like, oh, well, every time I see this kind of motion, this is what's happening on camera, whether it's like a certain emotion or whether it's just always an establishing shot, like it's a way to bring movement to an establishing shot. So again, that's sort of building up that file folder of instinct, right? So that when you're talking with a director, you're like, or the director says, this is, we start on this scene and then the characters go here, and you're like, okay, well, I can already tell you instinct wise, we need a techno crane, right? And then for the next shot, we move into this and blah, 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 2 cameras. So, is there, I guess the question of that is there any legitimacy to my technique? Am I foolish to do this? Or is this a way that we can catalog information that we see on screen and start to make sense of it and apply it to the shows or the films that we make?
I mean, everyone has like, their own sort of set of rules of like how they would treat a different thing. And I think like, I try really, really hard to make each project its own thing and to find new rules and like, so like, whereas you might use a big crane shot to like set up a scene in one film, if it's like, okay, so if we're doing this, it means we're like, showing off the expansive nature of this universe that the character's in, or whatever the case, whatever that means in this movie. In another project, I might try and either like, do something completely different, like never go up in the air, always stay on the ground, always be in whatever the case. I mean, and that's part of like the value of prep, is figuring out what the language of the film is. That's actually like one of the most fun things, is like figuring out a language specific to the project you're doing. It's always like great if you can finish something and have enough of a distinct style that people could make fun of it.
Yeah.
Like if someone can mimic it in a hilarious parody sort of way, then I think you've succeeded. Like, if you can find a language that's distinct enough that it's like, this is this film.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's, it's kind of.
And when you're in prep for whatever you're doing, how often are you actually taking the camera and doing camera tests and actually shooting some scenes to see if you can develop that language before principal photography begins?
Yeah, I mean, so never enough. Like, we always have big plans. I feel like on lower budget movies, you always plan on doing tons of testing and like trying things out and finding that sort of, and usually like that sort of stuff gets cut down to like 2 days.
Right.
But there's still an element of it that goes on, not necessarily on a professional camera. Like I the movie Lavender, where we wanted to do a bunch of, it was supposed to reference still photographs, and the director wanted to move into the still photographs. So it was like frozen moments, and except that the camera was going to move through them. And we were trying to figure out, it was a low budget movie, and we are trying to figure out how to do that, like what the low budget version of that is. And in the end, we settled like on a mix of like people literally freezing in frame, and some like objects that were like 3D that were added in post of like frozen things in the air, and then we had the camera on a Steadicam going 200 frames a second, and the Steadicam operator running like full tilt as fast as he could through the scenes. You could feel the camera movement and everything else was frozen. But we never had a chance to test that on Alexa. We tested it on like iPhones, because they just like the slow motion feature just come up, and we were running around the office like testing different speeds on an iPhone just to get the feel of it and like making people freeze. And it worked for that test. Yeah. There's a lot of stuff like that winds up happening where you're like doing lo-fi, like kind of amateur version sort of tests of things that will then, if it works that way, it's going to work on a.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually have a question from the chat here. And this is from Kirill Golovan. And Kirill asks, how hard is it to switch from being a photographer to a cinematographer?
I don't know. I mean, I wasn't, I think it depends on what kind of a photographer you are and what kind of films you want to make. I like, it's very common to reference still photographs in motion picture. There are a lot of people that come up all the time. Every director loves to reference Gregory Crewdson, which is like, I mean, he does like really cinematic still images that are like art photography. I think are fantastic. They don't, those images are made up of like multiple composites and like, a lot of like work to get them to where they are. And so that look is like only somewhat sustainable in motion. But I mean, I've had it as a reference a bunch of times, and we've I think done a pretty good job of getting there. But the things you have to think about in motion are quite different. You have to get it in camera in a different way than you do in a still image, and it becomes more. I mean, again, I guess it depends on the kind of photographer you are. Some photographers are storytellers, and some photographers are like product sellers. It depends. I mean, another photographer that comes up a lot in motion picture, and it's a completely different kind of film, is Nan Golden. Like people who are like just storytellers who are telling like, there's a lot of like, I mean, photography is such a wide, a widely diverse medium. There are so many different kinds of photography, and you can sort of, I can see someone like that, like a photographer who takes story-based images of like real people, being able to translate those skills into a certain kind of film, no problem.
Right. And there's actually two questions that I have that come from that core question. One is, if you are a photographer and you're fairly well established and you feel like you're doing well, but now you want to move into motion, what would you, like someone's having coffee with you and they're asking you this question, what would you advise them in terms of what's the next step? Do I just start hitting record on my camera, or do I try to find crews to like come and work for free on film sets like you did? What are the ways that they can get experience to start translating their still ideas into motion?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say it's the same thing I would tell anybody who wants to get into this. It's a combination of both things. Like I think it's important to get experience on sets in any capacity, just to see like the process and understand like the priorities and like the sort of teamwork that's involved and the process of collaboration, because filmmaking is a very specific kind of world. The way people work together is pretty specific, and you have to understand like the way that is in order to be able to like, you're working with a lot of people, and being able to just like make that work in a smooth and effective way is a thing you have to get from being on set at a certain level. But it's equally important to just go out and make stuff.
Right.
And like, they're both like, I don't think you can get too far with only one. You have to have experience with both. And it's just a matter of having on-set experience in any capacity.
Right.
And then start making your own things as much as you can. And like, that's a much easier thing to do now than it was like 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Everything was shot on film. And if it wasn't shot on film, it was immediately like, it was clear to anyone watching it that it was a low budget production. And now like the difference between like a $5,000 camera package and like a $300,000 camera package is like kind of nominal. It's like, I mean, it's huge in that those subtle like improve, like, the difference in quality between those packages is like crucial if you have the pressure of a like large scale production behind you. But if you have time and you're working on your own, then it's like you can accomplish a lot with a little right now.
Yeah. One of the conversations that I had in a previous live stream with Matt Barnes, who is a very successful photographer, was around this idea of art direction. And the thing about what we're seeing, at least what I'm seeing with photographers becoming cinematographers, is that they're usually so good at photography at this point that they really understand just what looks good. They have a really good concept of how to tell a story in a frame or how to art direct a frame. And I've always said to Matt that like his photos look good if you were just standing there in person. You don't have to look through a camera to see that, the fireworks going off and there's a good looking girl on a monster truck and like, it just looks good to the human eye. So, there's where at least where I think we're starting to see photographers becoming cinematographers because they are such great photographers. And I just wonder from your perspective, a key job in a cinematographer's world is understanding art direction, like knowing I'm actually going to give a shout out to my friend Rion Gonzalez, another DP here in the city. And years ago, I was like struggling with this one location. I was like, oh, I couldn't light it. It was like low ceilings and blah, blah. Like, assuming that he'd have some magical piece of advice, like how to fix this. And he goes, I just wouldn't shoot there. It's a horrible location. I just say no to the producer. Like, no, we're not shooting here. So what have you learned about working with the art department and having good art department skills or production design skills to know whether it's worth shooting in this location, or whether, how you need to make it look good in that conversation, how that happens?
Yeah, I mean, they're for sure your biggest ally. I mean, I actually was like looking at some stills before we started this, and I was like looking at how many times I've just completely depended on that collaboration to be able to light places that are unlightable, as well as make them look great without me doing any work. So a lot of the time, like the best answer is the simplest one. So if there's a place where and again, this depends on like what the action is and what the scene wants to be and where you're gonna. But a lot of the time, you need that help from the art department in order to be able to make a place work. If you know that's where you have to be. I mean, obviously, if you have 3 choices and you can pick one that's better, that's great. But I mean, as much as we all love to say like, oh, I wouldn't shoot there, it's a terrible location, it happens all the time where you wind up in a place that's not ideal for a bunch of reasons.
Yeah.
And that's the reality, like at every level of production. Like sometimes things happen and you just have to shoot in a place that's like not what you wanted. And so you have to figure out how to make it work and how to make it like the best version of what it possibly can be. And sometimes those are surprising locations. Like I've wound up in places, I'll show you still from a place we shot. Like I was on the season finale, the first season of Titans. The director, we had like a bunch of work to do in this day, and there was a scene that was like hanging still, and we had to figure out where to do this piece of dialogue. It meant to take place in the lobby of a hotel, and there was nowhere to shoot it that fit in our board, that like fit the timing of our schedule. And locations department just like desperately trying to find something for us in the area that we were shooting, showed us like a hallway in a mall. And I was like, it's supposed to be like a decrepit hotel in the like burned out downtown core of Gotham. And the director was like, it's great, it's going to work perfectly. And I was like, I can't see it. And he was like completely right. Like it was tons of art department work to make it happen. And the Grips did an amazing job. We basically like blacked out all the windows. We changed into this, I'll show you stills of it. And it's like, I forget like how terrible the location was when I watched the clip, because it works, it fits right in and it was fine. And sometimes that's just like, that's a part of the job as well, is just being able to like figure out how to make something that like looks like it will never work, fit in and work. Yeah. And I mean, if you don't have a good relationship with your production designer, that is worse than not having like the lighting package you need or the camera you asked for. Like that is the most important thing, that you're all working together and you're all on the same page. And
I'm super eager to move into these stills and start talking about that. But I just want to like finish with one little question about this. For people who are starting out, like let's imagine this photographer who's now just getting into cinematography, they may not have access to production designers. They may not have either the budget for it or just the contact list to get that. Yeah. Is there anything that you would say to people just starting out that don't have those resources in terms of what locations you want to stay away from, or things when art department isn't an option for you? Are there any little quick tip guides?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're working on a low budget project where people are like helping out and working for free, and you're not worried so much about your board and about like trying to mash things together and fit them into a certain day. You have the freedom to like spend the time scouting and find the right place, and find a place that doesn't need to be taken too far from what it is. The less money you have, the less likely you're going to be able to like manipulate one thing into something else. So it's best to find the closest thing to what you have in your mind, and then try and get it the rest of the way there with some dressing, and the rest of it's on you as a cinematographer, and in the lighting and the mood and in the I mean, I feel like you can completely transform the feeling of a space with lighting, as long as like it has the right amount of believability and texture and detail, and like has like the right sort of shape. And a lot of the time that's the most important thing, is like the shape of a room, and being able to like facilitate your blockings and the scene itself. You know, if you wind up in a scene where like it wants to be, for instance, I don't know, three people and they have to like at some point split apart and the room is like long and narrow, it's never going to work. You know, you need to find a place that works for whatever scene it is you're trying to shoot.
Awesome. We have one question here before we move into the stills you're going to show us. This is from Tom Samuel, and Tom asks, what piece of kit do you own yourself and bring on set with you every time? Or what is good for cinematographers to invest in for their own personal kit?
So, like my favorite thing for the longest time, and I actually have some pictures of it. I had like a bunch of junk, like a bunch of like LED strips, like taped to foam core with more foam core taped to the outsides and trace paper on top of it. And that tool we sort of invented on a TV show I did called Between, like years ago. And I just got this strip. A DP named Tim Hudson I met in LA, and he was showing me, and he started using it, and he was like, "This stuff is like really good color, has really good color and good output, and it's really dimmable, and you know, it's like so versatile. You should try it." So I went and I bought some. I bought a couple strips, and I brought them back home, and we started making these things. And it went from like being an experiment to like, I got to a point where I was like, I don't think I know how to light without this anymore. Like I've become so completely dependent on it. And now, I mean, now like so many companies have produced like professional versions of the same thing. And I mostly use I use a bunch of different stuff, but I use like a lot of Lightyear stuff, who made the strips in the first place. They were their strips were like the engine of my like weird homemade tape thing, but now they make light mats, which are a much like more expensive and professional version, but also like they're more reliable, and they work better, and they're like, you know, the crew don't look at me funny when I bring them out of my car. You know, and there are so many like better versions of all that stuff now, but the quality of light is like exactly the same. Like my homemade piece of junk that I carried around in pieces in my car for like 4 years was basically exactly the same in terms of what it did to all the sort of expensive LED stuff you can get now.
Right. And so fundamentally, you know, the light output is going to be, you know, undetectably different from the human eye. It was just like, you know, you have this thing that's not that durable. It can't,
Yeah.
you know, you can't rig it super quick. Things like that, you know, like that's fundamentally the issue.
I would defend it and say you could rig it pretty quickly, and that it was, I mean, like I still actually use them sometimes because they're really light, because you can make it out of nothing.
Right.
So it's great. You want to like slam something overhead or whatever.
Yeah.
I use them less and less, but yeah, the quality of light. And this was like a revolution for me, because I came up, you know, working on film and like HMIs and tungsten, and the depth you needed to create a soft light used to be like enormous. If you wanted to if you were in a room and you wanted to have a big soft light, you create a book light. You need to have like a bounce and a diffusion and like a light bouncing at that, and then you have to flag that after that, and try not to like block the diffusion with all your flagging. And it was like, you know, to make a good sized book light, you need like 12 feet of depth, and now you can do the same thing with like 8 inches. Yeah. So you can kind of build like softer, less sort of like directional lighting into tiny locations.
Yeah.
Which is like a huge revolution in the way people are lighting. I think it changes. I mean, I see it all the time in other people's work as well. Like just the style of cinematography is changing so rapidly because of the availability of that technology.
Right. Okay, we got a couple more questions, and then we're going to move on, I promise. Okay, this one is from Osman Arslan. He asks, or he or she, not sure, but asks, how does it work between the cinematographer and the production designer? Does the production designer follow the DP when it comes to color or placements of the lights?
No, I mean, it's collaborative. I think like we're partners in it. Usually it's like, you know, usually on the best productions I've worked on, it's usually like a that's people refer to as the sort of holy trinity. It's like the director and the production designer and the cinematographer have to work together at the beginning to figure out like what that is, what that power, and then, you know, that also has to be figured out in conjunction with like costumes and set tech, which is part of that firm as well. But all together, everyone has to sort of like get on the same page. But like the press center, cinematographer, and director sort of usually have an early conversation about that. And most of the time, the director has thoughts on palette and where you're going to be, like at different parts of the film. But then again, it is usually collaborative. So most directors, like if you were, oh, I lost you. I I can hear you. Yeah, can you hear me? All right. So I guess most of the time, if you're working with like a director who has thoughts on palette, but like opens it up, then they're usually open to you saying like, look, I really feel like this has to be this way because of this, and this. And if you have a good reason for something, then usually people are like open to that, and that goes for everyone. Like and oftentimes the director winds up getting like you start it that way, and the director will wind up like getting pulled away for like casting or like other things that they have to deal with, and so I wind up having like big conversations with the designer about things, and we'll sort of come to some we'll come up with some ideas together, and then go back and present those back to the director, and then sort of a back and forth like that. But yeah, I mean that relationship is so important. I can't like overstate that. That's like
it's sort of like, and it's super dependent too on the production, right? Because you have, on one hand, like if you're doing a sci-fi show, so many practicals are built in to the scene that kind of already dictates the lighting, right? That already kind of dictates kind of, half your lighting is already done for you versus, walking into just a completely empty room, like an old Victorian home or something. That might be a whole different situation in terms of like you have, it may change the complexity of a situation, right? And so it seems to me that it's, in some ways, it's the director and the production designer that tell you how the space is going to look, and then it's your job to kind of fill in the blanks to some degree.
Usually that's also like part of that collaboration. Like if you're working in a sci-fi set where lighting's going to be built in, you're usually part of that conversation. You would say like, look, if we're going to be walking people up and down these hallways repeatedly, and there's no room for any external light, I need the lighting to come from like either below or above or the walls, or like figuring out how you're going to use it and what's the right feeling, what's the right look, and working together with the designer. Like a lot of the time they'll bring ideas based on either like references or like an idea they have like on like a lot of designers are very sort of pragmatic and concerned with like verisimilitude and like the reality of what it would look like in that environment, which is great because like I don't sometimes know, like I mean that's not the case like sci-fi, but when you're dealing with like period, for instance, I don't have the same kind of knowledge base that they do, and like how would a building be built in this era, and like where would it be lit from, and like how would they approach, what would it really look like in real life. And so it's great when they bring you like the historical facts and say like, so this is a window would be this high, and a light would be here, and that's like that's where, and then I'll beg for one extra window and one extra light and say like, can we fudge it a little bit or whatever. Is a bit of a back and forth like that. But in a sci-fi set or something that's like where you have the freedom to design whatever, sometimes they'll like show you something that looks really cool but won't necessarily like the actors the way you want if you're going to use it practically. And then it's a bit of like, well, can you just like tilt those lights down a little bit or whatever, and sort of like you go back and forth until like everyone is comfortable with it, so it feels like it's believable and it would work as like a functional task light on the ship or on the whatever, and then also like does what you need to do as a functional light.
Right. And kind of further to that, I'm curious about your proclivity when it comes to lighting for motivated lights. There is a lot of DPs, just thinking because I saw it not that long ago, was Jojo Rabbit, and there's a great scene with Scarlett Johansson and the little girl where there's a light next to them, and you go to the one girl and you can feel the light on her face from geographically where the light is. Then you go to Scarlett Johansson and the key light's coming from a completely different direction. And in the interview with him, he's like, yeah, I just prefer to light to make sure it always looks good. And nobody really pays attention to this. So I don't always follow, the light's coming from that direction, so it has to be this way. How do you decide when to go with the trueness of where the motivating light is coming from versus every frame should just look good as it can possibly look?
My tendency is very much towards motivated lighting. I feel like I get taken out a little bit if it's unmotivated, unless it's like for a reason. And there are people that are great, like Bob Richardson does stuff all the time where it's like the light's not motivated, but it's motivated by the emotion of a scene, and he's like, you know, unapologetic about it. That's I mean, I think he's kind of amazing that way. I'd be like, yeah, I know that it doesn't make sense, but I needed this feeling from this scene, and so that's what we did. And on the opposite end, I guess like Deakins is like very, very respectful of motivation. And I think like, you know, they're both like brilliant cinematographers, and they're not like, when you look at the images, they're not so far off a lot of the time, but they're coming from completely different places. I'll go so far as to like, you know, if we're in a space and we haven't established it yet, and it's like, well, we're going to be here, and I really want to put the light there because that's what's going to look good, and that's what's going to like, you know, keep an actor's highlight where I want it to be, or whatever. I'll go so far as like to try and build that motivation into the room while we're blocking.
Right.
So like, you know, and a lot of the time if you're working in locations and you're doing work where you're not designing things from the ground up, where it's like low budget, you're moving quickly over, a lot of the time the most important thing in establishing the look of a scene is like tweaking the blocking to put it into a place that it works and that you can get your coverage without having like flopping keys or having people be cross-lit or like things that are like, you know, unintentionally egregious. If you want to like, you know, if you want to control the feeling of a scene and you don't want to spend a lot of time lighting or a lot of money lighting, or you don't have that option, a lot of time it's blocking. It's like and it's not like telling actors where to stand because that's absurd, but like watching where their natural tendency is to go, like, you know, blocking, saying like, you know, the actors they really want to be here and they really want to be there. And if all you need is like that instead of that to make it work, most actors are open to like tiny moves that aren't changing their motivation and their reason for being somewhere. And sometimes, like, you know, sometimes I'll find if you ask an actor why they want to be somewhere, sometimes it's because like, oh, I want to put my hand on this chair. So all you have to do is move the chair into the right place, and then their motivation hasn't changed. They feel the same about the scene, but you put it in a place where it's like it rotates the entire blocking into a place where it's like working with the natural light that's there.
Right. And in a case where like you have sun, for example, so you know on a 2-shot, you have one person that's backlit by the sun, you know, get nice rim light, but that inadvertently is going to mean that the other character is front lit. So in a case like this, do you then talk to, say, the production designer or the director about what makes the most pleasing background when somebody is completely flat and front lit? Or do you just try to cheat both of them in a different way? Or what's your strategy when you're faced with having to light somebody in a less flattering way?
I mean, that's like a classic setup that comes up all the time. Like two people sitting at a desk and there's one window in the room. Yeah. And like, it depends on what the scene is. If they're meant to be equal and it's just like, if it's about information and, you know, and you need to like get out of it quickly or something, or you don't have a ton of control, then sometimes you just rotate the desk so that the light's a side light on both of them, and you can paint the background and you can like motivate light from the same key side. And turning a desk doesn't change, like, again, it doesn't change like the actor's motivation or their reason for being there. Like, I'm still on this side of the desk, but you know, but a lot of the time two people are at a desk and one of them is like, there's a power thing you want to augment lighting as well. So maybe you want one person to be backlit, the other person to be frontlit. In that case, you know, then that's a fun challenge. You know, obviously the backlit one's like the easier, obvious one. But then, you know, there's lots of fun things you can do with front light as well. You can cut it off their face and like wrap around the fill side a little bit. And then will you also look at what the texture of the background is in terms of making sure that it's a different tonality and different texture from the character, things like that? Yeah, I mean, it depends again, like what color it is and what's on it and how far away it is and whatever. And you know, if you have the option of like dressing it, that's great. You can try and help yourself that way if you have but a lot of the time you don't. A lot of the time you go into a scene that's like, this is where we're shooting and you're backlit and you're frontlit, and then it becomes like a lighting thing. And then it's like, okay, well, so this person's frontlit, so we can drop levels and like make them brighter in the background and drop control the light in the background. And then like, you know, maybe if you have like, if there's like a little practical or something on the back wall that you can give them like a little point of light so it doesn't just go off to blackness, and you can have like a little bit of contrast and maybe a bit of like color contrast as well as like lighting contrast. You can sort of like build something beautiful in the reverse as well.
Right. Right. And I'm just curious too, in a situation like this, especially on larger shows, and where I'm sure you're working in studios where sets are being built as well. When a production designer goes in to start building a set, are they looking at fully drawn out boards about this person needs to have this little point of light back there because of the way they're lit, and then this person needs to have this back there, and they're starting to build that into the set? And then when you arrive, you're like, yeah, it's exactly what I needed it to be. Or how much are you changing that set on the day to make it work?
I mean, in a perfect world, everything is, you know, most good designers will build lighting into the set in more places than you need, so you have the option to turn things on and off. So you go into a location, it's like you don't know exactly where you're going to be. You end up here, and it's like you look, and there's usually something there that you can use, because they'll build like kind of twice the lighting that reality would have. Like in a normal house, you have like say 8 lamps in your whole house, and like 2 in a room, whatever. But you might sort of double those and leave most of them off, but have like ones where you need it, so you can change the feeling by depending on where you wind up being, how the scene blocks out.
Very cool. All right, I don't want to stick too long on this topic. I just want to get to this other question, and then we are for sure going to move on to the stills. Taylor Moore asks, what about the impact of COVID and the growth of virtual production? Do you have any thoughts on how the industry is going to be changing virtually?
I don't. I mean, I don't. I know as little as anybody else. I have no idea where things are going to go. I mean, I'm excited to see like Unreal Engine, like the new version, and all the. I mean, that PlayStation 5 demo that was out like a few weeks ago was staggering. I can't even believe how sort of realistic that's becoming. But even in that world, I'm not sure yet how that works. Like, I don't really know how that's gonna. I sort of feel like by the time that's usable and we've got a process in place for working with those sort of, I don't know. I feel like we hopefully are back to work by then, by the time that's released and available.
And I also think too, like people are afraid that technology is going to take away filmmaking jobs. And I don't have an answer to that more than anybody else does, but I feel like there's a whole group of people in this world that call themselves actors, and they love being on screen, and they don't want to be an avatar of themselves. They want to be themselves on screen. And so if the actors want to be there and people want to keep physically shooting, then there's still going to be a market there somehow. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think that's absolutely the case. I think like, even if there was a trend towards like full CG, like if it was like photorealistic CG sets and people and you could like design it all digitally, like the second that was a thing that was like, it's the second that gained any kind of like momentum, there would be like 5 people on the other end, and I'd probably be one of them saying like, let's do a low budget indie film and shoot it on, I mean, there's no way that one would rule out the other. I just like it would make the process of shooting real movies with real people like that much more exciting. I think like I don't know.
Absolutely, because that's what we're all in for, the experience. I mean, as a photographer, I shoot a lot of film, and people say, "Well, what's the point? Digital's so good." I'm like, it's about the experience. It's not about the final thing. It's awesome to shoot something and not know what it's going to look like until you get it back. That's
a great analogy. It's also like. On that line, it's also like the process. Like everything changes when you shoot. As someone, I began in film and made the transition like to primarily digital when everyone else did. I still shoot film for stills all the time. I shoot like medium format stills, and it's like I love the process of it. It's so different than shooting digital, and I shoot different kinds of things and like think about it in a different way. And shooting like motion picture film, you even think about like your composition differently, because you're looking at like a spinning shutter and you're seeing like the contrast of the image, but through an optical finder. Like it changes the way you work, and obviously it changes the entire process of filmmaking. But like that is a small transition between like film and digital compared to like the idea of like a completely digital world with like it's just I can't see a certain kind of film and a certain kind of like emotional experience ever being accessible in an entirely digital way. I mean, I'm sure beautiful things can happen. I'm totally like fascinated by the technology and love like when I have opportunities to play with it. But I think it's like anything. It's like it's a tool. It'll be great for some things, but I still really want to make like I mean, I like to do both anyway. I like doing like a, work that has like lots of VFX and lots of, toys but then I love doing like little indie films where it's like, two people talking in a room.
Yeah.
I love that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. All right, we're gonna move on. All right, bring us some good images here. Let's talk about some of your work.
All right. Should we look at, I've referenced a couple of things. We should go back and look at what I was talking about, and I don't even remember what I was talking about anymore. One moment. So we were talking about that hallway. Let's see if I have an image of that from season 1 of Titans. It's a good place to start if I can find one. I don't actually have one here. But here's an example of changing the mood of a scene with lighting from the same episode, because I was in that episode looking around, and this is a fun thing to take a look at. So here is do you see that?
Yep.
So this is from that episode. This is the interior of that hotel that the lobby was a mall. And this was built on stage. It was just like a small set of a hotel room, and there's a bunch of stuff that happens in here at night, and it's all like, this is actually lit, and this is another example of like really simple lighting. There's a practical. There's like, I think the light coming through the window is like a 650 with urban vapor gel on it, like to emulate a mercury vapor or a sodium vapor, sorry. And then maybe another like little thing coming through the other window. It's very simple. And then the light from, there's a TV you can't see on the right side, and that was my junky little LED light, giving him a little push from that side. And maybe we have a little ambience from above. I can't remember, but very simple. And then, this scene, we had a bunch of stuff to do, and it was one of those days where we were going long and we needed to get through our day. We were hitting like our maximum number of hours, and we still had one more scene to shoot, which was a scene in the same room of him on the phone. It was daytime. And while they were counting down, like we have like 4 minutes left in our day, we sort of turned it around, and we had the stuff waiting for it. And it was literally like a 5-minute turnaround into this, which was the exact same space, like 5 minutes later. Wow. And it's really fast and dirty. If you look closely, it's just, I think it was 2 4Ks coming through the window, but those could have been anything. I think it could have been M18s actually. In fact, I believe it was M18. So relatively small HMIs, mm-hmm. And maybe like a little bit of film, another junky LED thing just off camera. But
and geographically, were those windows on the other side of the quote unquote room?
Those are the same windows.
Oh, the same windows he was sitting in front of.
Yeah, you're looking at the same part of the room 5 minutes later.
Okay. And so you knew just to have those guys on standbys, and were the 18Ks like bare, or did you have them punching through any sort of diff?
They're 1800.
Oh, sorry, 1800 watts. Sorry, yeah, M18.
Little guys.
Yeah.
They're just they're probably through like Hampshire or something. Right. The M series lights, the area M series lights are like really efficient HMIs. So like these can plug into a household outlet, but put out like a lot of power. You can use them. And this is like a great light for indie film because you can plug them into a house. You don't have to have a generator, and you can still use them to light through a window. But they get that punch by having like a faceted reflector. So it's all just like it's the efficiency of the reflector that gives them that much light. But it also gives them a bit of a weird refraction thing. You see like a slight multiple shadow. So I usually put like a really, really, really light diffusion in front of it. So it's still a hard light, but it just changes the shape of the refraction a little bit.
And when using those smaller HMI lamps, one of the key reasons why DPs will go with larger HMIs is because the size of the lamp and the size of the beam looks a little bit more natural to sunlight. What is your thought on making the beam from an M18 feel a little bit more like a larger lamp? Just using more than one, or? So
actually, the great thing about like an old school 18K with like a Fresnel, like a big 18 Fresnel, it's not actually as realistic as a small hard source. It's popular because it's nicer looking, because it's softer, so you get a bit of wrap. So you have a hard light that gives you a little bit of a softer edge because of the size of the face of it. In reality, like the sun is like so far away that it's tiny. It's like much actually closer in appearance to like a smaller light.
Right.
But in order to get that punch. And you know, if you're going to put a hard light through, it's nice to have like a slightly softer edge to it.
Right. Yeah, and so
Which is
you're always putting like a light diffusion on that, like a Hampshire frost or things like that, typically.
I'm putting a Hampshire frost on this, but it's not really softening the light. It's just taking the edge of the shadow off. I mean, you know, softness is more a function of like the size of the source than it is like anything else. So, and that's why LEDs are so great, because you can spread them out over a big area.
Right.
So it doesn't matter like, you know, how much light you're getting. Sometimes you just need like the softness of it, which used to require big lights to make that spread. You'd use like a bigger source to get the spread, and then you put a bunch of scrims in it.
Yeah.
But now you can just use more light spread over a bigger area.
Yeah. And going back to those frames too, especially the first one, how much of the crushed blacks there is a result of the grade, and how much of that is you doing negative fill to just control the light levels in that room?
This would be pretty close to how it looked in the camera.
And there's just a natural fall off in that room, and because you're just using the one practical and then the 650 outside, and
it's mostly lit through the windows and like, you know, and a little LED so all the ambience you can see like on the back wall. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure how it looks on your screen. On mine, I can see like a fair bit of detail in the shadows, but it's pretty dark, so it sometimes gets folded when it's being.
Yeah, no, we can see detail in all the shadows.
Okay, so if you see like the reflections in his jacket,
yeah,
and you can see there's a little bit of that's like an LED in the right side that you can't see because of the frame there, but you can see that on the chair as well. There's a little teeny bit of light there. That's all from one of these junky LED things I'm talking about.
Right, and we're seeing a little bit of blue glow on the left-hand side, just left of the practical. That's coming from your LED lamp as well?
Yeah, it'd be a reflection. That's a kick from that same light. Yeah.
Very cool.
And it's not using neg. It's just that there's so little light in the room that there's nowhere for there's not much bounce happening, not much return happening anyway. You can see even that hard light coming through the window. When you see it on his face, he's still probably like only at a mid-tone where it's in that exposure, and like the LED light on his face would be like 2 stops under.
And when it comes to urban vapor, like whether it's trying to do sodium vapor or metal halide, things like that, you know, in this particular case, you're saying that you used a 650, which I'm assuming is a tungsten fixture with some
tungsten.
Yeah. I mean, nowadays we have all these amazing RGB lamps that we can dial in exactly the Roscoe or the Lee gel number for that. But did you always have it for people who are working on smaller budgets and might just have tungsten fixtures? Do you have a strategy about trying to emulate these lights and what base fixture is better, whether it's a daylight source or a tungsten source?
It's all to your eye, and depends what you've set your camera to as well. I mean, I don't use hard lights very often in interiors, but if you want to have like a piece, you know, the feeling of a hard light outside, it's the only way to get it is, you know, like that's mostly through windows and stuff like that. I would use, if we're not trying to create like a shaft or a piece of like a feeling of like a street light, that's supposed to be like a street light right outside the window. I use like, you know, Titan tubes or sky panels or things like that usually.
Yeah.
But when you need a little quick hard light, I'll go to tungsten just because they're like fast and easy to control. You know, the ability to like really change the feel just by spotting flooding and using barn doors, and I like them. I still like little tungsten guys once in a while.
Awesome.
Not that frequently, but they're like, you know, if you were building a tiny kit of lighting, you wanted to go and shoot like an indie movie. If I were building a kit out of my junk, I'd probably still carry like some 650s.
Yeah. Cool. I've got one last question here from Tom Samuel. When you shot this nighttime scene, did you put some, oops, my screen just went dark on my phone here. Here we go. Did you put some general lights to lift the shadows to have some detail in there, or there's no detail? We kind of answered this question already, but I figured we'll finish it off here. Or was there no detail because you knew that it wasn't necessary?
Yeah, we wanted it to be like one of the darkest moments in that episode. It's he's alone in Gotham City, and it's actually like a dark fantasy in his head, and it's like the low point of that whole season actually for him emotionally. So we just wanted it to be like dark. Right. So there was nobody wanted. I actually had another practical on. The director asked me to turn it off because he wanted it to be even darker. He was like, too much light. Only one light should be on.
That's the rare. Most directors don't go, you know what, this isn't dark enough. This needs to be darker.
Depends on what you're working on, you know?
Yeah.
I think he was right. I think it was nice to have the one practical, but it's like it's a meant to be a very, very dark moment.
Awesome.
So
Normally, this is when I cut the conversation off because we've reached our hour here. But we haven't gone through enough of your stills, so I want to take this an extra 5 or 10 minutes just to go through a couple more stills, if you don't mind.
yeah, I'm trying. Let's look at some stuff. Like I was talking about lighting, and the sort of conversation began when we were talking about like the difference between a bigger budget film and a lower budget film, and I was saying that a lot of the time you find yourself in situations where you're in the center of, there's like a big crew and trucks and stuff outside, and then in the inside it's just like a few people. And frequently, like I look on the floor in those moments, and like the really emotional scenes where it's a couple people, it's kind of just like a little bit of junk. And so here's a great example. This is from Stockholm, and this was like a really emotional moment between this Numira Past and Ethan Hawke. And it's a pretty important conversation in the film, and everyone else has sort of gone to sleep, and they're there, and there's just this one fluorescent on the wall, and that's basically what we use to light the scene. It's just this one. I'll show you the reverse if I have it. But it came down to that. Like after all the lighting and everything we've been through, the most important moment in the scene was just a single fluoro on the wall that they've tucked away from everybody else to have this conversation.
And are we looking at an actual like T12 fluorescent tube here, or are we looking at a Titan tube?
No, I cheated. These were they were LED tubes, but they were before Titans. They were before like Astera had come out.
Like Quasar?
Maybe a Quasar. I can't remember. Something like that.
So it's just, I mean, at the end of the day, it's not an RGB fixture. You're just looking at replicating what a fluorescent would do anyways, right?
Yeah, it was like, we had them set like halfway between tungsten and daylight or something like that.
And I wonder too, if it sounds like, looking at just these stills that you've shown us, when it comes to large productions or indie productions, at the end of the day, the simplest solution is often, not always, but often the best solution. Is that sort of a message that you'd get behind?
Yeah, 100%. 100%. Yeah, I liked, like when you're looking at a scene trying to figure out, like if you're in a situation where you need to like light a scene that you hadn't necessarily figured out before, you're trying, or you have an idea and then you watch a block and you want to change it. A lot of the time, the first thing I'll do is like look at what it actually looks like. What is the, either with like just windows or practicals, or like what does it look like to your eye? And then frequently like that doesn't work so well on camera. So it's trying to figure out like, well, how do I perceive it in my brain? And then trying to make it look like that way on camera. So it's just augmenting it a little bit and just trying to make it look the way it looks in reality on camera. So the closer you can be to that, the better.
Right. There's, production designers will often say that, the best way to do an indie film is to sort of avoid period pieces, because period pieces really rely on this incredible set deck, whether it's costumes or just like having realistic, tools that they would have used at that period. Yeah. Would you say from a cinematography perspective that there are certain types of narratives or certain types of scenes that are just really difficult to light and do actually require a decent budget, and that indie filmmakers should try to avoid if they don't have the money there? Anything come to mind?
No, I mean, I think I think designers are right. I think like the glaring mistakes are always like in the design. Like, you can kind of, if you have a believable set and a believable situation, like if the world of the art department looks believable, then you can kind of get there. Right. Yeah. I was going to show this. This is another example of super simple lighting, but also blocking carefully. So this was actually just available light.
Wow.
And this is maybe I put a little LED through the window from the foreground, like from the right side of frame, but the windows in the background, we went into this space, and this is sort of to what you were saying. This is supposed to be the 70s, and it's a pretty low budget production. And we found this abandoned police station, or it was an office, but it looked exactly like an old police station in Hamilton. And all these windows, which of course are supposed to look out to Stockholm, and we couldn't afford to do a composite green screen in every shot. So we just put these like vertical blinds on it. And we found, and this was a completely dependent on the production designer and I working together to find a fabric for the windows that would No. That would transmit light and still have texture. This is Aidan Leroux, who I worked with a couple of times, who's great. So it's, when you work with someone you know well and have a good relationship with, it makes it a little easier. But finding a fabric that would do this basically, and we looked at tons of samples and finally found like the right thing. But then we were able to shoot this just by timing it to the right time of day and making sure we were there when we needed to be, and we were able to just roll camera and shoot like the entire depth of it without doing really any lighting at all. Now I should say also, this we had to wind up having to come back to this location at night and make it look exactly the same. So then we had a ton of lighting. But if you plan your day properly, and on any film you would just do that. You would just like schedule everything properly so you're there the right time of day and have the right, shoot in the right direction, and you can get that look very simply.
And that frame, are we looking at knowing the arc of the sun on a direct sun day when weather is favorable, or is this, and then you just diffuse the windows, or are we looking at light that's on a generally overcast or non-direct sun day?
So we shot this in both hard and soft light, because it would sort of start and disappear by the end of the day. But the texture of these vertical blinds was like, that was the diffusion. Yeah. We didn't have anything else. They would, so you could see the slight difference in the way they glowed, but not much. And so you could mostly do the rest of it in color.
And did the production designers present you different blind samples, and then you're kind of holding them up to the light going, that's...
Yeah, we talked about this a lot. I mean, he and I looked at this location together and we were like, okay, we want to, so we actually did, there's a part of it that we left open sometimes, and we put a green screen out, and we would occasionally do a little comp of Sweden for like, if it was an important shot, we were like, okay, and I think in the end, those wound up not getting used, if I'm correct. But we did plan to have a couple of shots where we'd see out, but most of the time we figured they were like setting up office. They didn't want to see the protesters outside. They would just close these verticals and work in their little bubble. Right. And I think it was like really effective. We were able to get a lot of stuff really quickly in space just by like blocking it towards those windows as much as possible. Right. And just filling in faces and, keeping lights sort of coming from that side and motivated by those windows, but manipulating them a little bit based on
yeah. Is your preference, if the sun, the physical sun, doesn't play a role in the narrative, like, like the director says, oh no, the sun has to be beaming in, it's like sunset and blah, 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 blah. If that's not the case, if it's just, you just need the light source, is it your preference to try to get into locations where you're going to have direct light and then soften or work and shape that direct light? Or is your goal to try to get something that's maybe north facing that you'll have more consistent light throughout the day? What's your preference?
It depends on a lot of things. It depends, like, most importantly for me, what's outside the window. Right. Because if you're going to look outside the window and it's north facing and there's a white building across the road, you're going to be fighting that burnt out white building the whole time. And that's like worst case scenario. It's also really bad if you have like, sometimes trees and stuff like that. They can make your entire room go green if you're in front of the trees right outside the window, and then you just get like tons of green light inside, and then all of your lights look magenta and you have to like balance to the green from the trees. And, if you're trying to do as little lighting as possible, I think north-facing windows can be problematic unless you're just going to diffuse them and not see out. Right. If you want to see out the window, again, like at different levels, you can do different things. If you have total control, you can control the sun with a shelf and then bring your own light in. That's right. And then whatever's across the street is dark, so you have the ability to control your exposure a little bit more. Yeah. But if I've shot stuff like where you're on the 15th floor. It doesn't matter how much money you have. Once you're up high enough in the air, you can't get anything convincing through those windows anyway. So you're working with light. You work a lot with the just with your schedule, and that's when that's when your greatest ally goes from being the production designer to the AD, and then you're like begging them to schedule it around the sun. So it's like then it becomes about like I need to be like in this shot at this time of day and this shot at this time and this shot at this time, and as much as you can try and chase it so that it keeps consistent. Right.
One of the things, obviously Hollywood doesn't have to deal with this, or Miami necessarily, but here in Toronto, especially in the summertime, you might have a really nice clear morning, but then by the afternoon in the lake effect, you have just these intermittent clouds that just kind of keep going on and off, on and off, on and off. What's your strategy to work when the weather conditions are just so constantly changing and the light levels change?
Again, it depends on what you're doing. If you're like on the main floor, then I just have everything standing by, and I just light to
Yeah.
match. You know, there's a scene. There's a scene in Titans. I wonder if I can find it quickly. From the first season where we didn't know, the weather kept changing. We didn't know it was going to be the case. It was a south-facing window, and I wanted the hard light coming through. There was some sort of like some shears, and it was mixed. Um, but we wanted hard light coming through those windows, and so we were shooting somewhere else ahead of time. We didn't know what it was going to be like by the time we got there. So I had a big line of 4Ks all the way down the thing. Like there were like 12 windows and all ready to go. And we got there and the sun came out and we just shut all the lights off and dropped them on the ground and shot with the available light. Because it's way, I mean, the shafts of light from the sun are so much better than anything you can create with all the resources in the world. It's like fantastic. So yeah, sometimes you just have to be ready for it and be ready for both scenarios.
Right. Yeah.
And you know, hope that you get what you. Let me see if I can find that.
While we're waiting here, and we'll wrap up with this last frame here, but we got one last question from Kirill. And Kirill asks, what is your favorite color scheme from some of the movies that you've shot? So from one of the projects you shot, which is your favorite color scheme, and do you have an example of this?
That's a great question. I don't know if I can answer that. What's my favorite color scheme?
Do you have a proclivity towards certain things? Like I know, some DPs just always tend to use certain lighting schemes because they like it. Do you have any ones that you tend to stick with?
I really don't like magenta typically. So I have a tendency to sometimes drift towards green in an effort to like avoid magenta, but and I like yellowy tones more than pinkish skin, for instance, as a rule. But then like as soon as you say that, you end up in a situation where you want to have the opposite for whatever reason, you know, and it comes up sometimes. You know, again, I feel like it's got to be motivated. Like if I look through, you know, a group of stills from any film, I feel like it's more the tone of the movie than like the, you know, like if I blast through like Stockholm, for instance, because we were talking about it. I mean, it's the 70s in Sweden, so it's like it lends itself very naturally to like this was like one of our first days of shooting.
Yeah, and you can see there's more of a yellow green. There's almost no magenta in that, you know, in perceivable magenta.
Yeah. But this also, I mean, I felt like it was motivated by a lot of the things we looked at,
Right.
a lot of the references and a lot of and the locations in the wardrobe, and like everything was sort of in that palette.
Right.
And of course, you know,
And when we think of the 70s too, we do tend to think of these beiges and browns and these warm tones, right? So
we go into like this film gets tighter and tighter and tighter. We start in basically the outside, then the lobby of the bank, and then in the inner halls, and then wind up in the vault. And we spend like half the film locked in a vault. And so it got like darker and slightly more oppressive as we went inside. And this was, and also like a little bit more blue and green starts to creep in. It's sort of warmer on the outside and gets more into this palette as we get inside. But it's still consistent. Like, you know, her skin tone doesn't change much. And obviously you have the warm tones from the wardrobe. It sort of worked their way through the whole thing. But then I don't know. I mean, I love playing with different things. That's kind of the fun of it.
yeah,
I love like, you know, I mean, Titans has like a lot of cyan in it.
yeah,
And that's like motivated by a lot of things, but it was like, you know, very much part of the look of the show, especially first season. And like one of the first things, like my second episode, I was like, I actually think this has to be entirely warm this episode. Not the whole episode, but there's a whole sequence that was like, and I mean, this was very early on in that season. But it was like, okay, well, this is the palette of the show, and it's all cool, and now we're going to go into a different world. This is where like we introduced Doom Patrol, and it was like, well, actually, it's this, you know, she's a old Hollywood actress, and this is supposed to be a sort of the first place that Rachel feels comfortable that one of the characters, she's away from her other life and it's supposed to be, so we just immediately went into warm, and it's like so much fun when you have a thing and then you break it.
Yeah, exactly. And one last question for me before we wrap this up, which is when it comes to color tones and lights, obviously in the world that you live in, the story really dictates whether you're going to have cyan in there or whether it's going to be a warm or, there's some sort of thing that's motivating a pink or green light or whatever.
Yeah.
But in a lot of independent cinema and music videos, there's just like, it's an RGB bar fest. There's just like colors everywhere all the time because so many lamps can do it now within the fixture itself. Do you have any advice in terms of helping new cinematographers and new filmmakers understand when the right time is to understand color theory and bring color in to affect a scene, and when the right time where it's just sort of gratuitous where it takes away? Do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's like part of the fun of music videos is you don't have to be restricted by
That's
by
right.
any motivation. I mean, like I love shooting music videos because you could just kind of like do whatever feels right for the song, and your motivation is the music, and it's like if I feel like cyan and pink, and then it's cyan and pink because that's like what the music feels like to me. When you're telling a story and you're working as part of a team, then the motivation for the color has to come from a more story driven place. You can't just sort of go off on your own and start putting colors into the world that aren't like part of everyone else's plan as well, and aren't sort of like, I don't know. I feel like it's a bit irresponsible to try and like do something that's in contrast with what you're working on. But there are, like, having said that, there are like some really good DPs that use tons of color. Um, all right. Thanks very much. Take care.